Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin. I bear witness that no one deserves to be worshipped except Allah Ta'ala, the one who has no partner and no similar, the one who has no length and no width and no depth and no perimeter, the one who is not a volume and is not in a place. And how could he be in a place when he existed before time and space? He created everything except himself, including you and your actions. Nothing occurs except by his will, both good and bad, he destined to happen. He speaks without sound, letter, or language, not Arabic, Hebrew, nor Korean. He's not light, he's not a spirit, he has nothing in common with human beings. He's not in the direction of up, down, right, left, front, nor back. And whatever you imagine in your mind, Allah is different than that. And I bear witness that our noble, unrivaled master, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, is the slave of Allah, his final messenger and the best of all of God's creations. May Allah unite us with him in paradise and grant us a drink from his basin. And may Allah increase us in patience, humility, knowledge, and comprehension, and help us to put our knowledge into practice, and grant us all sincere intentions. Ameen. Ameen. We're continuing in the book, the Hadrami Introduction, Al-Muqaddimah Al-Hadramiyya, by the Allama Bafadl rahimahullah. And we have, it's a beginner level text in Shafi'i fiqh, for those who aren't familiar with it. We've made it in this book to page 23. Page what? 23. We're at the bottom of the page where it begins a section titled Asserting Judgment. Asserting Judgment. Page 23, bottom of the page, Asserting Judgment. So before we start reading this text here today, I want to make a couple things clear before we get into it. First thing I want to clarify before we get into the text is the concept of trustworthiness. What does it mean for a Muslim to be trustworthy? Okay. In the Sharia, there's two different kinds of trustworthiness. There's trustworthiness suitable for narration, and there's trustworthiness suitable for testifying in court. We're going to leave the testifying in court to the side because that's not the kind of trustworthiness we're talking about today. Trustworthiness of narration, meaning if you bring news, if you pass on something that you saw or heard, is the listener able to accept your words? This kind of trustworthiness is called trustworthiness of narration. And trustworthiness of narration requires certain characteristics. In order for someone to be trustworthy, it must be the case that they are a Muslim. It must be the case that they do not do any enormous sins. It must be the case that they do not do a lot of small sins. And it must be the case that they restrict themselves to the manners of the good Muslims in their social class. Okay, I'm going to say it again. To be trustworthy, first off, you got to be a Muslim. Second off, you need to be someone who doesn't do any enormous sins. Third, it has to be the case that you don't do a lot of small sins. What do I mean by a lot of small sins? I mean, it's not the case that the small sins you've done outnumber your good deeds. Okay, it's not the case that the small sins outnumber the good deeds. That would be a lot of small sins. Okay. And the last case is you observe the manners of the good Muslims among your peers. So, for example, whatever job you have, say you're a barber, you cut hair, that's your job. You observe the manners of the good Muslims who are barbers. Okay, if you're a lawyer, you observe the manners of the good Muslims who are lawyers. You don't do things that the good Muslims that are in your social class would not do. Okay, for example, if you're a lawyer, You would not walk around with grease all over your clothes, because the good Muslims who are lawyers don't do that. Okay, but if you're a mechanic and you got grease on your clothes, well, then you might still be trustworthy, because the good Muslims who are mechanics frequently have grease on their clothes. Okay, so it's about like making sure you don't do the things that the good Muslims in your class of people would not do. All right, these are the criteria to be trustworthy. All right, no enormous sins, don't do a lot of small sins, and they observe the manners of the good Muslims among their peers. That's what's required to be trustworthy. In this chapter, there are going to be things where we say, if a trustworthy person does this, or a trustworthy person does that. I want you to understand what we mean by a trustworthy person. Second thing I want to do before we read in the book is give you just a brief overview of how it works. And then when we read the book, inshallah, it'll make more sense. So in general, the way this works for the salat times, and alhamdulillah, the past few lessons, all of you, inshallah, have learned how to know when the salat times come in by observing the signs, by observing where the sun is, or where the shadows are, or how long the shadows are, okay, or whether there's redness in the western sky, or whether the light of Fajr has appeared in the eastern sky. Okay, these are the signs that we've talked about. Okay, you know these signs now. Excuse me for one moment. Assalamu alaikum. So, alhamdulillah, the past few lessons, you've learned the signs that show that a salat time has begun. Okay, you know those signs. But the general rule, though, is that, how do I say this? You may not pray a salat that has a specific time until after you know that the time has come in. Okay, you need to have some kind of evidence that the time has come in, and based on that evidence, you now have knowledge that the time is in, and only after that can you pray the salat. Okay, if you don't have that knowledge, or you don't have that evidence, then you can't make the salat. And in fact, if you tried to make the salat, if you said Allahu Akbar, your salat would not even begin. Okay, that takbir that you said, it would not initiate a salat, because one of the conditions of the salat is that you need to know the time is in. Okay, what are we talking about? We're talking about salats that have times, like the 5 obligatory salats, for example. Salats that have times, you can't pray them until you know the time is in. Okay, and the basic rule is you know that the time is in by looking out your window and observing the signs that we talked about in the past few chapters. Okay, observing if the sun has set or if the darkness is approaching from the east for Maghrib. Observing if the redness disappeared from the western sky for Isha. Observing whether the light of Fajr appeared in the east for Subh. Observing whether the sun has passed its zenith, or whether the shadows have begun pointing towards the east, or whether the shadows have begun lengthening. These would be your signs that Dhuhr has begun. Okay, and you know whether the shadow has grown by the length, the length of the shadow has increased by the height of the object. That would be your sign that Asr has come in. We know these signs now, alhamdulillah. And the basic rule is when you observe these signs, then you know the time is in, and only then can you begin the salat. But the Sharia, alhamdulillah, does give you some other options. It's not the case that you have to observe it yourself for every single salat, although that is the basic rule. You need to observe for every salat, but you don't have to do it yourself. Okay, it's possible that if a trustworthy person who knows these rules, they know the signs of the salat, and they looked out the window and they confirmed that the salat time is in. Okay, they confirmed it. by like the proper way, by observing the signs, and they're trustworthy, and they told you the time is in. Okay, you can go by that. You don't have to go look for yourself. Just because you're able to look for yourself, it doesn't mean you have to look for yourself. You're allowed to rely on a trustworthy person if that person is informing you based on him or her looking directly. Okay, there are also other things that you can rely upon to know whether the salat time is in. So although the default is you need to look yourself, the truth of the matter is there are options. You don't have to always look for yourself. We're going to talk here in this chapter, inshallah, about what are some of the alternatives. Okay, and keep in mind that sometimes it's cloudy. So sometimes you won't be able to look yourself, because looking yourself, you won't be able to observe any signs. Okay, so it's important for you to know some of the alternatives. Okay, let's read, inshallah, page 23 at the bottom, where it says, asserting judgment. The author, may Allah have mercy on him, said, whoever has no knowledge about the time. Okay, so who are we talking about now? Someone who doesn't know if the salat time is in or not. Maybe it's in, maybe it's not in. He doesn't know. Okay, and it could be that he doesn't know because it's cloudy outside. And because of the clouds, he can't see any shadows, and he can't see where the sun is, and he can't see the light in the sky, etc. Or it could be that he is in a location where he can't see. So maybe it's not cloudy, but maybe he's locked in a prison cell with no windows. Okay, and so he just can't look. Okay, but whatever the reason is, sometimes a person is not able to go look for the signs himself. And sometimes he is able to look himself, but he doesn't want to for whatever reason. What alternatives do we have? He says, whoever has no knowledge about the time should take the information of a trustworthy person who informs him based on informed knowledge. Now, I should tell you the word informed here, it's not in the Arabic text. The Arabic text simply says based on knowledge. I believe the translator here added the word informed because there are two ways that this can happen. One way that you can have a trustworthy person inform you based on knowledge would be if that trustworthy person observed the signs with his own eyes. He went out, looked with his own eyes, he saw that the sun set, and so then he comes back and says to you, the time is in, the sun has set, Maghrib is in, Maghrib has entered. He says something like that to you, okay? In this case, you can go by his saying, because he's trustworthy and because he's knowledgeable. Okay, he knows how to recognize, like the rules that we talked about in these past few chapters. He knows how to recognize from the signs whether the salat time is in. And he actually went and observed those signs with his very eyes. Okay, so one way that you can be informed by a trustworthy person is if that trustworthy person got his knowledge empirically, like by witnessing it. He witnessed the sunset, or he witnessed the shadows start lengthening, for example. Okay, so he witnessed it, and by witnessing it, he acquired certain knowledge that the time is in, and then he informed you. And because he's trustworthy, you can take him at his word. That's one way that this whole informing, taking from a trustworthy person can happen. Another way that it can happen, though, is by means of a chain. So what if the trustworthy person who told you that the sun has set and Maghrib time is in, what if that trustworthy person is not the one who saw the sunset with his own eyes, but rather he was told by a trustworthy person, and that trustworthy person is the one that saw the sunset? Still, you can accept the saying of the trustworthy person who's telling you based on informed knowledge. I believe the translator added the word informed in order to cover this case, the case where the one who's telling you maybe doesn't have direct knowledge from his own observation, but rather he's conveying it with a chain. Okay, this also works as long as everyone in the chain is trustworthy. So if person A observed the sunset and he said to person B, hey, the sun has set, Maghrib is in, and then person B tells person C, and person C tells you that Maghrib is in, as long as A, B, and C are all trustworthy, then you can accept what person C said to you. Okay, you have this option. Even if you are someone who's able to go look yourself, you know how to determine the salat times yourself. Even if you're able to do it yourself, if you're informed by a trustworthy person who either directly observed that the time was in, or he was informed by a chain going back to someone who observed directly, then you can accept that. This is what's meant by being informed on informed knowledge. Okay, it means that there's a chain or there isn't a chain, but in the end, at the end of the chain is somebody who observed it directly with their eyes. Okay, let's talk scenarios here. One way this can happen is a person looks out his window, he sees that the shadows have started to lengthen, so he knows, because of his knowledge, that means Dhuhr is in. So he has knowledge of how to recognize the salat times, and he's trustworthy. So he tells somebody trustworthy, and that trustworthy person tells somebody trustworthy until it reaches you. That's one scenario. Another scenario is like the way it used to be in the past in the Islamic countries, where the mu'adhin, the person who calls the adhan at the mosque, that person would always be a trustworthy person. And that person would be someone knowledgeable about how to recognize when the salat times were in. And that person, since there weren't any apps and calendars and things in the past, that person used to observe, used to go up on top of his tower, observe when the salat time was coming in. And once he saw the sign that the time was in, he would call the adhan. So this also is a trustworthy person who confirmed that the time was in by his own eyes, then informing people that the time is in. How did he inform them? By calling the adhan. Okay, because for all of the salats except for Fajr, you may not call the adhan until after the time is in. Fajr, there's an exception for Fajr. You can call Fajr early. But the other four salats, you don't call the adhan until after the time is in. It's haram to call it early. So the trustworthy person who confirmed based on knowledge, based on observation, that the time is in, he might call the adhan. And then everybody else, including the ones who have the knowledge to go and look for themselves, they have the option of accepting what that trustworthy person said when he called the adhan. Why? Because we know that person who's calling the adhan is trustworthy and knowledgeable, and he doesn't call the adhan early. Okay, he always calls the adhan when? After he confirmed the time is in. When the person calling the adhan is like that, then anyone who hears his adhan can take him at his word. Unfortunately, that's not the case nowadays. Almost all of the masjids these days, the one who calls the adhan is not actually observing to see if the salat time is in. He's just going by whatever his app says or whatever the schedule on the wall says. He's just going by that, which means you can't go by his saying. Okay. Furthermore, it means he's not trustworthy. Okay, it means he's not trustworthy because this is not this type of action, calling the adhan before the time. This is something that would break trustworthiness. Remember, to be trustworthy, you have to avoid enormous sins, avoid doing a lot of small sins, and you have to observe the manners of the good Muslims among your peers. Good Muslims would not call the adhan early. So this breaks trustworthiness. Furthermore, it may even be an enormous sin, although I'm not 100% sure about that. So nowadays, I do not advise anyone to take the adhans as some kind of sign. Okay, just because you hear the adhan, unless you know that the one calling that adhan is a trustworthy person who's knowledgeable about how to recognize when the salat times come in, and he never calls the adhan except after confirming the time is in. If he does all of that, then you can take his adhan as evidence, and when you hear it, you can pray. You can consider that you now have knowledge the time is in because you have evidence. In this case, the evidence is what? It's the trustworthy person informing you based on knowledge. Okay, based on what knowledge? Because he saw it himself. He observed the signs himself. So he's informing you based on knowledge, and he's trustworthy. You can accept that. Or say you're too far away to hear that person's adhan, but somebody knocks on your door, a friend comes to visit you. He mentions that while he was driving to your house, he heard that person calling the adhan. Okay, and as long as that friend of yours visiting your house is trustworthy, then you can take him at his word that so-and-so called the adhan. And you know that that person is someone who is trustworthy and knowledgeable and doesn't call the adhan early. Okay, if these things are true, then you have that option. Is what I'm saying clear, or am I being confusing here? All right, what I'm saying here is, if you're able to observe the signs yourself, the default is that that's what you do, but you're not required to do it. You have the option of taking a trustworthy person at their word on the condition that this trustworthy person either observed the signs himself and he's knowledgeable about how to recognize the signs, or he's passing on information from a trustworthy person, from a trustworthy person, from a trustworthy person, from a trustworthy person, with a chain that ultimately goes back to someone who confirmed that the time was in by what? Witnessing it. They had the knowledge of recognizing when the time is in, and they saw the signs in person. Okay, you have that option. Okay, let's go back to the book, page 23. He says, after that semicolon, or from the adhan of an individual man who calls it. Okay, that's like another example of the same type. Okay, if a person calls the adhan and he's trustworthy and knowledgeable, and you know that he doesn't call the adhan early, then he is the same as the first example, a trustworthy person informing you based on knowledge. Okay. Now, what if you don't have that? What if there is no trustworthy person giving you information that the time is in? Which, let's face it, is usually the case. Okay, usually if you live in the US, there's no trustworthy Muslim coming and telling you that he saw the signs or that he heard an adhan from someone who meets all the criteria we just mentioned. Usually there is no such person. So in this case, you can resort to a third option, which is to rely on something that's not a trustworthy person, but is nonetheless tested. It's like tried and true. You've tested it, and it has shown that it's reliable. What would an example of that be? It says, or the call of a tried and tested rooster. Okay, he gives an example of a rooster. Okay, if any of you have ever lived in a place where there's chickens running around, you know roosters can be very loud. And roosters make a lot of noise. I know in the cartoons, they always start making noise when the sun rises, but in real life, roosters make noise all night long. All in the middle of the night, they screaming, and they're very loud animals, mashallah. But sometimes you get a rooster where that particular rooster does not make noise until after Fajr comes in. They wait until there's light in the sky, and then they make the noise. It's just like in the cartoons. They wait until there's light in the sky, then they start calling out. So if you've tested this rooster, you've noticed, man, that rooster never calls out before Fajr time. He doesn't call out until after Fajr is in. If that rooster is tried and true, if that rooster's been tested, then you can rely on it. Meaning that if you hear the rooster start making noise, that becomes your evidence that Fajr time is in, and you can pray Fajr just off of hearing the rooster, because the rooster was tested. Okay? It's not quite the same thing as a trustworthy Muslim, but nonetheless, it's tested, it's tried and true. So if there is no trustworthy Muslim around to inform you, then you can resort to something like the rooster. Of course, you still have the option of looking out the window yourself and determining the time by yourself, looking at the signs. But if you don't do it yourself and there's no trustworthy Muslim, you can resort to some other thing that's tried and true and tested, such as a rooster. Another example of something tried and true and tested is like a clock or a watch. If you have a clock on your wall or a watch on your hand or a phone that tells the time, if you've tested it and you found that it keeps good time, okay, and not all clocks do. Not all clocks keep good time. You know, some of them are slow, some of them are fast. But if you have a clock or a watch that does keep good time, then you can also depend on that. How do you depend on a watch? Because you know that the salat times don't move very much from day to day. So if you observed yesterday, for example, that the sun set at 8 o'clock, and maybe today it's cloudy and you can't see, or maybe today you just don't feel like getting up and looking, okay? But you know that this time of year, Maghrib is coming in later every day, okay? Every day it's coming in a little bit later. Each day it moves by 1 minute, maybe as much as 2 minutes, but it never moves by more than 2 minutes from one day to the next. Well then, if your watch keeps good time, if you've proven that your watch keeps good time, well then, when your watch hits 8:02, that's evidence that Maghrib is in. Why? Because you observed yesterday that Maghrib came in at 8 o'clock, and your watch keeps good time. And you know it wouldn't come in more than 2 minutes later today. So by 8:02, you now know that the time is in. Here you're basing this on the fact that your watch is tried and true and tested. Okay, this is a sign that you can use. And this is one that, you know, we resort to frequently when it's cloudy. You know, when you can't look to see the sunset, you just say, well, yesterday we observed sunset at this time. And sometimes it'll rain for many days in a row. You know, people who live here in Baltimore, in my community, they know what I'm talking about. You know, in Ramadan, I'm telling them, don't eat yet, don't eat yet. I don't care what your alarms are saying. I don't care what your phone is saying. Don't eat yet. Don't eat. Wait until we observe the sunset. And then the next day it'll be cloudy, so I add 2 minutes. And then the next day is cloudy again, so I add 2 minutes. And the next day is cloudy again, and I add 2 minutes. And what happens is after like 4 straight days of it being cloudy, you know, I'm now quite a bit later than whatever the actual sunset time will be. But I have no choice because I'm relying on the clock. You know, and then maybe on the 5th day, it's a clear night, and I get a better look at the sunset, and I can say, oh, well, you know, we didn't have to add 8 minutes. You know, adding 5 minutes would have been enough. You know, you kind of correct yourself once you're able to view again. You know, but all of this is based on what? The fact that your watch keeps good time. So you need to test your watch and make sure it keeps good time. Again, not all of them do. Let's keep reading. Then comes period. Okay, that period is very important because he's separating now between one type of action and another type of action. So we're saying if you are able to see the signs yourself, then you can do that, but you have the option of taking the word of a trustworthy person who's, you know, who comes with a chain that ultimately ends with someone observing the salat time entering. And if there is no such person, well, then now you have a choice between observing yourself and relying on some thing that's tried and tested, even though it's not a trustworthy Muslim, something like a rooster or like a clock or a watch. You have options among those things. Okay? But next, well, actually, even this next one, you still have an option. Let's read the 4th one. Maybe this period should have been placed somewhere else. It says, if one cannot find, meaning if you can't find, uh, you couldn't find a trustworthy Muslim to inform you, and you also couldn't find a reliable thing like a rooster or a clock, then what do you do? It says, if you can't find any of those things, then one should make an attempt. When he says make an attempt, he means make ijtihad. He says what you do is you want to find some evidence of your own that you can use to indicate that the time is likely in. That the time is likely in. Okay? And he says using something like recitation. Okay? He gives an example of recitation. Okay? You can rely on that as well. Again, if it's tried and true. For example, let's say that there's a person every day, he goes to the masjid, he prays Maghrib in Jama'ah. After he prays Maghrib, he prays 6 Sunnah rak'ahs. After his 6 Sunnah rak'ahs, he recites Al-Wird Al-Latif. After he says the Wird, he recites 1 hizb of Quran. After he does 1 hizb of Quran, then after that, he says his other wird, which let's just say for the sake of example, his other wird is, he says Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim 200 times, then he says Allah 200 times, then he says La ilaha illallah 200 times, then he says Astaghfirullah al-Azim wa atubu ilayh 200 times, then he says Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam 200 times. Okay, he does this every day. After Maghrib, he does the 6 rak'ahs, he says the Wird al-Latif, then he says 1 hizb of Quran, then he says his other wird, and he knows from experience that by the time he's done with all of that, Isha is in. He's tried it, he's tested it. He knows that it's always the case that by the time he's finished doing all of that, Isha has come in. Well, then what that means is he has the option of relying on that. He can pray Maghrib, pray his 6 rak'ahs, finish the rest of his regular wird, and when he's done, he can just stand up and he can pray Isha without going to look out the window. Even if there is no trustworthy Muslim to tell him Isha is in, even if there is no, rooster or clock around for him to rely on, he can rely on his own action because he knows that that set of things that he does will not be finished until the next salat time is in. Similarly, that's what it means here by recitation. Maybe it's not limited only to recitation of Quran. It's recitation of whatever it is you recite. Might be Quran, might be dhikr, might be dua, might be some combination of the 3. But if you have a regular thing that you recite and you know from experience that by the time you're done, the next salat time is in, then you can rely on that. And once you're done, that's your evidence that the next salat time is in. Okay. What does he say here? He says, or a piece of work. Or a piece of work. So it can be something you're reciting with your tongue, but it can also be something you're doing with your body, some kind of work. Like, for example, let's say someone is a tailor and they sew clothing. He has a needle and thread, and he has like a thobe. And he knows from experience that by the time he sews up the hem on the right side of this thobe with a double stitch, doing it by hand, he knows that by the time the right side of the thobe has been stitched, it's Isha time by now. Okay, he knows from experience that the amount of time it takes him to do a proper double stitch hem on the side of an adult thobe, he knows how much time that takes him. And he knows the next salat time will be in, and so he can rely on that. Similarly, if the action that he's doing is not something like tailoring, whatever work it is, say it's his job to transcribe stuff, he needs to type out a certain amount of text, and he knows that by the time he finishes typing this amount of text, that the next salat will be in. Or maybe he does a certain amount of salat, Earlier I gave an example of a lot of things, and amongst it was 6 rakahs. But maybe this person, he does, 100 rakahs. And he knows that by the time he's done with his 100 rakahs, that the next salat time is in. As long as what you're doing is tested, okay, it's tried and true, you have reason to believe that by the time you complete it, the next salat time is in, well, then you can go by that as well. And again, you still have the option of looking out the window yourself and determining the salat times yourself, which is always the best option. But, if you don't want to do it, or if you can't do it, like say it's cloudy, or like I said, you're locked in a room with no windows or something, then you can rely on these other things, such as hearing a rooster, or how long it takes you to recite your daily wird. That's why it says, or something similar. He's not saying this is limited to recitation or some kind of piece of work. These are examples. But any specific activity that you do where you are very familiar with how long it takes and very familiar with the fact that if you complete it, the next salat time will be in, then that's something you can rely on. MashaAllah. Somebody asked, can we rely on the sounds of the birds in the morning? Well, you have to test it. Okay, so if you actually observe with your eyes, you look out the window, you observe with your eyes when Fajr comes in. Okay, you know when Fajr came in based on observation. And you confirm that the birds did not start making noise until after that. Okay, and then you test that. You test it for a while. And you've confirmed, these birds have never made noise before Fajr. Well, then, yes, once you've confirmed it, once you've established that this is a habit of theirs, then, yes, you can rely on the singing of the birds in the morning. But you have to test it. For example, I know that at my house, there are birds that sing early. I know it. I've confirmed it myself. In fact, one of these birds, I've heard them at like 11 at night, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. Like some of the birds, they just make noise whenever. So you need to actually test it. Okay, and if you can distinguish between the birds, if you know, oh, that's the one that calls early, but then that other one, oh, that's the one that always calls after the time is in, then yes, you can rely on it. But it has to be confirmed. He says, as for the one who is blind, okay, so for blind people, this issue is basically the same, but it has some differences, because a blind person, to begin with, they can't look out the window and see if the salat times are in. They can't see if the sun has set, or if the shadows have started growing, or if the shadows pointing this direction, or if the redness is in the sky. They can't see these things. Yeah, it's the habit of birds to birds, their habit is to sleep when it's dark and to only wake up when there's light. So if you were in a pristine place with no artificial lights, the birds wouldn't even wake up until Fajr is in, and then you would hear their singing once they wake up. But if you live in a city with a lot of artificial light, the birds get confused. They start thinking it's daytime and it's not daytime yet, and they start making noise when Fajr didn't come in yet. It happens. You just need to confirm the situation where you live. Anyway, as for the blind person, the blind person to begin with is not able to look out the window and determine the salat times the normal way. Okay? But the blind person can rely on a trustworthy person informing him. So if he hears the adhan and he knows that that person calling the adhan is trustworthy and knowledgeable about the salat times and doesn't call the adhan early, he can go by the adhan that he hears. Or if another trustworthy person tells him the time is in, okay, and it's because that trustworthy person observed it himself, or he has a chain back to someone who observed it himself, well then the blind person can go by that. Just like the blind person can go by the rooster. Okay, the blind person can go by his own wird. If he also says a certain amount of things after praying Maghrib and he knows that Isha is in by the time he's done, he can rely on all of those things. So the blind person is not really different from the seeing person. Okay, if he's able to confirm the things we're talking about. A blind person may have difficulty confirming himself uh, whether that rooster, like whether Fajr is always in when that rooster starts making noise. Or he may have difficulty confirming himself that when he finishes saying this weird, Isha is always in. Um, you know, uh, but if he were to get that knowledge somehow, he can rely on that. Um, and in any case, the blind person has the option of just following another trustworthy person's ijtihad. Okay, so if the blind person doesn't have any means for himself of figuring out if the time is in, um, he has the option of just following someone else who determined that the time was in through one of these non-standard means, like relying on how long it takes him to say some Quran or say his wird, or how long it takes him to sew a hem on a garment, etc. As long as that person is trustworthy, okay, and he has knowledge about the action he's basing his ijtihad on, then the blind person can follow that person's ijtihad. The blind person can simply say, hey, this trustworthy person finished his wird, and according to him, by the time he's finished his wird, the next salat is in. He's finished his wird now, so the blind person can go by that, by the actions of someone else. The blind person has that option. MashaAllah. Let's read what it says here. It says, as for the one who is blind, then he has a choice of following someone who is trustworthy, and by trustworthy we mean trustworthy and knowledgeable about how the salat times come in, or making his own decision, meaning he, based on whatever he's able to do in his condition of blindness, so perhaps reciting something, if he has established something that when it's complete likely means that the next salat is in, then he can rely on that. Keep in mind that these things I'm mentioning, not all of them are as strong as the others. Observing for yourself is very strong, because if you see that, the shadow now is pointing towards the east, like it went past straight north, well, then for sure Dhuhr is in. Right? That's certain knowledge. Okay? Whereas if the trustworthy person tells you, that's less than certain knowledge, because a trustworthy person, even though he's trustworthy, he can be mistaken. Like, he's not infallible. So there's a small amount of doubt there. But nonetheless, you have what we call ghalabatul dhann. You have enough evidence that most likely, you conclude most likely what this person is saying is true. And that's enough to most likely know that the time is in. You don't have to always know for certain. So it's enough to know most likely it's in. Okay, but there's a chance that person is wrong. And then if you resort to like the rooster or your clock, that's even less likely to be right than the trustworthy Muslim. Okay, and if you resort then to something like your own actions, how long it takes you to sew something or how long it takes you to recite something, there's even less certainty there, because you might say it faster today than on your normal day. You might sew a little faster, or the garment today might be a little shorter than your usual garment. There's more uncertainty there, but in all of these things, you have enough evidence for you to conclude most likely the salat time is in. And that's enough to permit you to pray. And I remind you, if you have not done one of these things, then your salat is not valid and doesn't even start. Okay, if you just say, I'm gonna pray Maghrib now, and so you make a takbir and start praying Maghrib, and you didn't look out your window, and no trustworthy person told you Maghrib is in, and you didn't rely on anything like a clock or like a rooster, and you didn't rely on some action that you did, you had no evidence whatsoever that the time is in, and you just decided to pray, well, then guess what? Your salat never began. You said Allahu Akbar, and the salat did not start. Okay, I want to make very clear here, these are things you have to do because these are conditions of the salat. Just like how if you go to salat without wudu, then that means your salat doesn't count. Same thing here. If you go make salat and you haven't confirmed the time is in by some kind of evidence, then guess what? You didn't make a salat. It's the same thing. Or like if you weren't covering your nakedness. You know, you go make salat and your nakedness isn't covered, then the salat won't count. These things are conditions. The validity of the salat depends on these things. So if those things aren't done, your salat doesn't start. Okay? I just want to make sure that's clear. But the other thing I want to say is that some of these signs are stronger than others. And what that means is it's possible that you could be wrong. Right? It's possible that if you're relying on, okay, by the time I finish this, the next salat is in. It's possible if you said it really fast today that, the next salat actually wasn't in. So what do? He says, if one is certain that one's salah was performed before its time. So if you find out, all right, we're talking about an example like you prayed Maghrib, you did the 6 rakahs and all the other things that you normally do, and you believe that by the time you're done all of that, that Isha time is in. But on this particular day, you stood up, you prayed Isha, and when you were done, somebody informed you, hey man, Isha was not in yet when you prayed that salat. You know, and I mean like certain knowledge. I don't mean like that person maybe is wrong. I mean, if you get like conclusive proof that you prayed your salat early, what do? It says, then one makes it up. What do we mean by he makes it up? We mean he has to pray that salat over again. He has to conclude that the salat that he prayed before the time was in did not count. And what does he do? He needs to pray it over again. When do you pray it over again? Well, if you have the opportunity to pray it over again before its time goes out, then you have to pray it again before the time goes out. But if the time has already gone out, well then you pray it again later. Okay, how soon do you pray it again? It says, and it is recommended to initiate making up a salat. What he means by initiate is immediately do it. Do it right away. Initiate right now. Start the salat right now. Okay, so the recommendation, if you miss a salat, is to make it up immediately, meaning at your very first opportunity. That's what's recommended. It's also recommended to pray it before the salat which is present, when one is not afraid that one will miss it. So if you say you found out that you prayed Maghrib early, before the sunset, okay, but by the time you confirm that you prayed it early, now it's Isha time. Okay, you missed your chance to pray to make it up while Maghrib was in. So what do you do now? It's Isha time. Which one do you pray first? Do you make up your Maghrib first and then pray Isha after? Or do you pray Isha first and make up your Maghrib after? Well, the recommendation, the sunnah, is what? You make up your missed salat first, and then you pray the salat whose time is currently in afterwards. All right, you make up the missed salat first and pray the salat whose time is in afterwards. Okay, as long as you're not afraid you're going to miss the salat that's in. Okay, because the salat that's in, you have to pray it within its time. So if you found out that you prayed Maghrib early and now, I don't know, say you fell asleep, you woke up and now it's the end of Isha time and you don't have enough time to pray Maghrib first and then pray Isha. You're scared the Isha time will go out if you do that. Well, in that case, you pray Isha first. So Isha will be done within its time, and you do Maghrib later. But as long as you're not afraid that you're going to miss the Salat that's in, then the Sunnah is to pray the one you missed first. He says, even though one might be afraid that one will miss the congregational prayer. Okay? So even if you're in a situation where you know you have time to pray the Salat that's in, you know you have time. Okay? But if you pray the one you missed first, you might miss the Jama'ah. You might miss the congregational Salat. Which one do you pray first? In this case, you pray the one you missed first. The Sunnah is pray the one you missed first, and then pray the one whose time is in, even if it means you miss the Jama'ah for the one whose time is in. This is the Sunnah. This is the recommendation. It's not required for you to do it this way, but this is the Sunnah. The author continues, it is obligatory to initiate making up the missed prayer that one has missed without any excuse. Aha. So if you didn't have an excuse for missing your prayer, well, then now it's no longer sunnah for you to pray it immediately, meaning at your first opportunity. Now it's wajib, it's obligatory for you to pray it immediately at your very first opportunity, because you missed it without any religiously valid excuse. Okay? You have a religiously valid excuse if you tried to figure out the Salat time and you were wrong. That's a religiously valid excuse. Okay? Or if you were asleep, that's a religiously valid excuse for missing a Salat. Okay? But if you did not have a religiously valid excuse, then you're obligated to make up the Salat at your very first opportunity. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. We'll stop here, insha'Allah ta'ala. I will go through questions now. Insha'Allah, if you have a question, type it in the box. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh, for those who salamed me. Someone said birds are reliable. I'm going to repeat what I said before. Do not assume birds are reliable. You have to test them. Just like you have to test that rooster to see if it only makes noise after the time is in. Test the birds. Okay? You might find that the birds are reliable. You might find that they're not. You test them. Okay, someone asked a question and I'm not sure I understand it. It sounds like she's saying it was time for Asr and the person began the Salat, but in their intention, they intended to pray Dhuhr. Okay? But that person, if I understand it correctly, you're talking about somebody who missed the Dhuhr prayer by mistake. They didn't realize that they had missed Dhuhr. Asr time is in. They're ready to pray Asr, but in their heart, they intended to pray Dhuhr because they were like, as I sometimes say, on autopilot. Somewhere in their mind, they knew that the next Salat they have to pray is Dhuhr. They, somehow didn't notice that they didn't pray Dhuhr during its time. Now it's Asr time. They want to pray Asr, but they intended Dhuhr by mistake. In this case, this Salat would not be valid. Okay, in this case, the Salat would not be valid because the person, they're trying to intend asr. As I understand your question, what you have here is like you might say, a slip of the tongue for the mind, like a slip of the mind. In your heart, what you wanted to pray was asr, but what you thought was dhuhr. Okay, and this leads to confusion and doubt about the intention. And doubt about the intention is one of the things that breaks the salat. So that salat would be broken by that confusion of intention. In this case, you just start the salat over again, intending correctly. Someone asked, can you pray a makeup salat? Like you're praying a salat and your intention is to make up a missed salat. Can you pray that in the jama'ah with the group of people who are praying the current salat? The answer is, it is valid. Yes, you can do that, but it is disliked, so I advise you not to do that. Okay, it's disliked for you to pray a salat different than the salat the imam of the prayer is praying. So if you know you're going to pray something different than the imam, it's better that you don't join him. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I'm going to make a comment here. One of the people, he put in his comment box something about Allah knowing what's in your heart. Okay. The topic of this class is fiqh, Islamic law, sacred law. It's rules, laws Muslims have to live by. Every Muslim is required to obey the Islamic law, to stay within the boundaries of the Islamic law, this law which we call the Sharia. Okay, it's not about Allah knowing what's in your heart. A person can have good intentions, but still do an action that's against the Islamic law. In that case, what's going to be written is that he committed something haram. He did something against the Islamic law. His good intention is not going to turn something haram into something permissible. A good intention is not going to turn something invalid into something that is valid. Okay? We got to stop with this nonsense about Allah knowing what's in your heart. Yes, it's true. Allah does know what's in your heart. And yes, it's true. Allah will judge you on a day of judgment based on what's in your heart partially. But what he obligated you to do in this life is to obey the Sharia. And he obligated you in the Quran that if you don't know something, to ask the people of knowledge. Don't just say, oh, Allah knows what's in my heart. If you're not sure, you ask and you get the answer. You find out what the Islamic law says about your case. You don't just say, Allah knows what's in my heart. Okay, because it may very well be that whatever you did was invalid and needs to be prayed over again. And if you don't pray it over again, then on the day of judgment, Allah is going to judge you for skipping that salat. And it's not going to matter that in your heart, you did it lillahi ta'ala, but you went against what Allah ta'ala told you to do. You understand? It doesn't make sense. You can't disobey Allah for the sake of Allah. Okay, those things, they conflict. You know what I'm saying? You can't say, oh Allah, I love you so much, I'm going to go against everything you say. You can't say, oh Allah, I disobey you for your sake. Okay, that doesn't work. Okay, there's obedience and there's disobedience, and the only way to know the difference is learning the rules. Okay, we are not Christians. Okay, so many of us in this world over here in the US, We think like Christians. Christians don't have very specific rules, or at least most of the denominations don't have specific rules and laws that they have to follow. Christianity has general guidelines. Be a good person, treat others the way you want to be treated. If it's about love, well then, your heart is pure. It's about love. It's the Christians who have this whole thing that's intention this, intention that. In Islam, it's the rules that matter. Our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Innamal a'malu bin niyat." He said, the deeds are rewarded according to their intentions. Okay, the deeds are. What deeds is he talking about? Good deeds, deeds that are done properly according to the rules of the Sharia. If you do the deed properly, well, then it'll be rewarded according to your intention. If you did it lillahi ta'ala, then you get rewarded for it on the day of judgment. If you did it for the sake of the dunya, well, then your reward will come in the dunya. If you did it for the sake of the people, so that people will praise you, well, this is a sin of riyah, and you don't get any reward for it. Okay? Like if you do a deed properly, your intention is going to impact the reward you get for it. But if you do a deed improperly, then guess what? You did it improperly to begin with. Why would you get rewarded for something you did wrong? So, Brother Andre, I don't even understand what you wrote in your box here about the Dajjal. But in any case, the Dajjal is a fitna that Allah Ta'ala will send to the world that tests us in what? Iman, in Aqidah. Okay, the Dajjal is not about deeds. It's about belief. It's about something in your heart. It's not about things you do with your body. This class is a class in fiqh. It deals with the actions of the body, the rules that govern what we do, rules that tell us whether a salat is valid or not valid, rules that tell us whether an action is rewardable or not rewardable, rules that tell us whether an action is haram or whether it's halal. It deals with actions. Okay, there's a whole different science, not fiqh. There's a science called aqidah that deals with matters of belief, matters of creed. And in that science, you study what's a valid belief and what's an invalid belief. In that science, you study which things take you out of Islam. Okay, the fitna of the Dajjal is a test in Aqidah. It's studied in that science. This science is Islamic law. It deals with something else entirely. But since you're suggesting we sit in the masjid and talk about these things, well then, if you see me in the masjid, I invite you to sit and ask me about it. Someone asked if you are ill at Maghrib and Isha, like you have a stomach ache or headache or something like that, are you excused? The answer is no. You are never permitted to miss a salat no matter your condition. Okay, as long as your mind is still present, okay, as long as you're still sane, like you haven't lost your mind, then you must pray all the salats on time. Okay, so no, there's no excuse for missing a salat due to illness. Rather, what there are accommodations. You know, for example, say you are, because of an illness you have, you're not able to stand up. Like if you stand up, you're dizzy and you fall down. So it's harmful to you if you stand up. In that case, you pray sitting down. Okay, but it doesn't mean you skip the prayer. It doesn't mean you let the time go out without performing the salat. Okay, and something like a stomach ache or a headache, in most cases, you can still perform all the positions of the salat properly. So just push through it, insha'Allah ta'ala. So Andre Brown, this very argumentative brother, may Allah guide you. It's true, war is an act. Okay, but what does that have to do with the topic at hand? War is an act. It's governed by the rules of fiqh. Okay, this particular beginner level book doesn't go into the issues of jihad, but yes, war is an act. Okay, and like our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, your intention depends. The reward for that action depends on your intention. So if a person fights for the sake of Allah and His Messenger only, he's rewarded for it. If a person fights for the sake of Allah and His Messenger, but also wants people to see how brave he is, then this person gets no reward for it. In both cases, the deed was done correctly, but the intention was different, and that's what causes the reward of it to be different. But the deed itself was done correctly. He fought in jihad. Okay? You're trying to make up cases, but you need to think of a case where there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. I'm talking about a case where there's a right way to do it, but the person didn't do it the right way. He did it the wrong way, a way that's invalid. And what I'm saying is a good intention doesn't make something invalid become valid. All right? If you did something that's valid, your reward depends on your intention. Okay? Simply doing something the valid way does not mean you get rewarded for it. Your intention has to also be good. But if you did something in an invalid way, then guess what? You never did the deed. Okay? If someone says, oh, I'm going to pray Asr, and he decides to just pray 1 rak'ah instead of 4, I don't care what his intention was. I don't care if he says he loves Allah so much. He did it lillahi ta'ala. It's absolute worship to Allah. If he only did 1 rak'ah, guess what? That doesn't count as Asr. It doesn't count because Allah Ta'ala told us that Asr is 4 rak'ahs. Okay? And you don't pray Asr 1 rak'ah, no matter how good your intention was, it's not going to count as Asr. You're not going to get rewarded for praying Asr if you only did 1 rak'ah. Okay? You have to do the act properly, and only then does the intention come into play. If you did the action improperly, then if it's obligatory, you're still responsible for performing it properly. Inshallah, that's understood. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Let's say La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallim. رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات رب اغفر لي وللمؤمنين والمؤمنات. Barakallahu feekum. I'll see you inshallah ta'ala next week at the normal time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.